Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Truth Foragers. We're here once again on the Boys from the Baltic Stars channel. We'd like to thank the boys for allowing us to use their their channel. We have, of course, been asked not to return to many other channels in our time, but the boys have been very understanding and they're very supportive in their own way. I couldn't say they're actively supporting of us, but in fact, I've been cautioned that I can't say they've been actively supportive of us, but they have left the keys in the lock to their studios and allowed us to record in there. Um, we are the Truth Foragers. We have been snuffling for truth truffles since it says here since 2023. That's the start of the channel. For you, especially Rick, it's been a much longer time that you've snuffled.
Oh well, I go back, as they say. I think my first genuine foraging experience was probably in the late 70s. So yes, it's been a while.
You're a man who I have often looked to as a true outlier in the whole process of truth foraging. You put yourself out there in places that people fear to tread. You use
Mm.
techniques and approaches that others call foolish, but you get results, Rick.
Some do call my approach foolish. Some, however, call it insane. So you can take from that what you will.
And a lot of people have done, especially in the local newspapers a few years back, where there was a rather nasty smear piece about you. I hope that you got them to apologise for that.
Um, well, yes and no. I think it's fair to say. I got to correct the record about a number of factual errors. They, for example, got the year of my birth wrong and the make of my car. However, uh, there were elements of the smear campaign they chose not to retract, which were, I suppose it's fair to say, opinions rather than facts. Um, and it became difficult to have the conversations with them about exactly what I needed retracted because they seem to find it hard to respond with anything other than gales of laughter, which is uh, it's difficult to argue your point in that kind of environment.
It's a very good point. And you're a man that doesn't back down from such a thing, but when you're in a room with thousands of people laughing, it's difficult.
It is a problem. Also, I mean, I will put my hand up to having made a few mistakes in the legal theory and strategy that I used to pursue my argument, um, because of the nature of the matter that had led to the problem in the first part. I decided to conduct a considerable amount of my defence in Old Kentish, and that proved to be probably a poor choice with the benefit of hindsight.
I can see the angle that you took from there, and I think it follows a certain law of the land, which I think was probably the defence you would have taken. But not
It,
everyone
I mean,
truly understands the language.
it is a thing I've encountered before. When I covered um, my Assyrian and Eastern Mediterranean series on demons and specters, um, it seemed completely logical for me at the time to write it in Hittite, but that, as a number of people pointed out, may have significantly reduced its cross community appeal.
Mm. Your but I believe your Hittite piece on Phil Spector was used as part of the prosecution against him.
Uh, yes, that's absolutely true. I'm there, of course. We did have the advantage that while the prosecution and defense may have had difficulty understanding my point. It did turn out that the presentation process itself did throw Mr. Spector's own conduct into sharp relief, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, good evening, Legitimate. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, our fellow forager. It's lovely to have returning foragers with us this evening, and a subscriber too. The boys will be absolutely delighted at that. I believe we get 3% of all subscriptions that the boys take from people subscribing to the channel. That's very helpful. That pays for each subscription pays for a manila envelope, which is always good for mailing out documents, Rick.
I'm saving my portion up for a pencil. I need a new pencil.
Yeah, well, you and me both. It's rather stubby at the minute, but I do what I can with it. But will do, Mr. Legitimate. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And this is a good point, I guess, to do the remainder of the introduction. If it is your first time here, you are very, very welcome. If you've been here a number of times before, like Mr. Legitimate here, one of our wonderful foragers, you'll understand how the evening works. But you should all have received, as soon as you log on, you should all have received an automated email to an email address that our software, I hate to call it hacking device. There's got to be a better term for it. But our software manages to find your email address. It sends you a document to fill in. It's the usual legalese. Don't worry about the small italic paragraph. We're all friends here. Just complete the answers to the best of your knowledge. There will be a urine sample container heading to your postal address. Please fill that as well and return it by carrier pigeon to one of the two addresses at the bottom of the sheet. Rick, I did hear that you did confuse a shipment the other week of urine samples with organic apple juice, which you had ordered from a local shop.
I did. I mean, thankfully, it didn't go as badly as it could have, because obviously there's one way round that could have been really bad. But you'll be delighted to know that, thankfully, I I managed to retain enough of the apple juice after I'd sampled some to also test it for the appropriate DNA markers.
Well, that would explain why our 40% of our viewership appears to be living in fields.
It is a slight drawback to the testing methodology, though it does, I think, point to the accuracy of the test as well.
I think so. Even in mistakes, true greatness can shine through, which is a wonderful thing.
I would argue that on average, it is actually through mistakes that most greatness shines through.
Well, happy little accidents, as the one of the great minds of history once said.
Indeed. I mean, you say great.
Now, maybe we can look at some mysteries surrounding him another time. We could have a whole evening on it. There's quite a few, it must be said. Um, but for this evening, we're going to look at three mysteries that we have researched. Some maybe you've spent more time researching, months and years. Others less time. There's one that Rick spent a little bit more time than me, and one that I've spent a little bit more time than Rick. But I'm sure, dear viewers, you'll discover that as we progress through. You are more than welcome to join in with us. We're an interactive show after all. If you have any questions about any of the research that we're looking into, any of the urban legends, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. If you yourself have, these are all incredibly famous urban myths anyway, if any of you have researched them at all, please feel free to put in your points that you may have discovered as well. We will take that into consideration and it might help back up our findings. As already half spliced as shown in chat, there's another couple of ways that you can interact. At the end of each of our urban myths, Rick and I will decide whether we believe or remain skeptical. And you, dear viewers, can spend 50 of your credits to announce that you remain skeptical or believe, and we will pop some up on the screen and we'll make a bit of a visual treat of it. Also, if you feel that there's a time where things are getting dark and you don't know where to turn, you can always call on Vincent Price, who will bring us a small amount of help and rescue from the dark pits we may have found ourselves in. But anyway, my name is Dickie Waghorn. I'm here as always with my wonderful friend Rick Bishop, and it is our pleasure to talk through three very famous urban myths this evening. But before we do, Rick, you have famously written a number of pamphlets on the best tips for truth foragers. Perhaps while I sort out the first graphic, could you share one, not one of the new ones, we want people to buy your new pamphlets, but maybe one from your earlier pamphlets, maybe a hint or tip for a wannabe truth truffle snuffler.
Oh, of course, I would be happy to. One of the essential ingredients, I think, in any truth forager's um, kit bag is a minimizing glass. Um, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is the complete opposite of a magnifying glass. There are times when closely examining an object where it can actually be helpful to see it as if from further away and in less detail, which often makes it feel more authentic and definitely more accessible to the mind because it looks more holistic from a distance. Now you can get minimizing glasses. However, the ones that you can get for sale, I often find are both unnecessarily expensive and usually don't come with a convenient handle because they're intended for things like cameras. So it's actually, I find, much easier to polish your own disc of glass down to minimize, um, which admittedly takes a fair amount of time in order to do it well, but produces, in my experience, the very best results.
This is priceless information. Thank you very much, Rick. I'm sure people are taking notes. Um, if they do want your latest 100 top tips pamphlet, um, is it still £2.99 delivered, or have you lowered the
Um,
price again?
it's it is 2.99 in the only outlet that it's currently available through, which is back rooms of public houses. However, in practice, that's therefore negotiable.
Well, there you go, dear friends. Maybe find yourself. You're wonderful at snuffling for truth truffles, dear friends. So maybe snuffle to find out where Rick is drinking one night and lay your hands on his wares. Price negotiable. Um, but we're going to start this evening. It is a special, to some extent. Um, we're sometimes we try and bring together our urban legends under a theme. We've done festive theme. We've done movies. Sometimes we look at local tales. Sometimes we research tales from a long time ago. Um, Tonight, as I was looking at which things we've been studying, and I sent you the list a little while ago because, of course, we planned this in advance, Rick, for a few months to get everything together. I decided that we'd pull together three urban legends where there is darkness at the core, for they all have something of the night about them, Rick. And the first one is um, is one that you first approached me about a long time ago now. This is one of my earliest piece of research that I did with you. It's the case of the cursed clock face. Pat Rick, this is something you were looking into for a while. Please, where did you start and when did you hear about it?
Well, this, as you say, has been something I've known about for a long time, and I've dipped in and out of. For quite a long time, I thought there were some interesting comments, interesting thoughts, interesting ideas that had crossed my mind, but I hadn't got really enough to properly get my teeth dug into. Um, and then, as often happens, the more you go back to it, the more you read around it, I saw more and more things that kind of connected up to it. So, for those who are not familiar with the myth, though, truthfully, this dates back to Victorian England, and I think an awful lot of people would be very familiar with it. There are references, though very oblique, that can be found in traditional British novels and even in the design of buildings and courtyards around the great English cities. So the story goes that um, a person who at the time I first heard the myth, that the name was unknown and is still very much a controversial one, um, had decided to make a special clock, and this this clock was at the time uh, quite the focus of some gossip in polite circles in London, because nobody people had heard of it but didn't know um, exactly where it was or who had made it or where it could be seen. Um, as everyone knows, a traditional clock has parts that are named from human body parts, the face and the hands. And this clock face, which was constructed by some form of craftsman, was in fact, so the story goes, made with a human face and two human hands as actual ingredients in the makeup of the device. Um, and that's one of those things where you think, well, that's interesting, and perhaps for the less experienced um, snuffler for truffles, a little bit a little bit creepy. Um, but that's as far as I had right at the beginning. Just the fact that some craftsman in London had made a clock using an actual human face for the face and two actual human hands for the hands. Um, but when I mentioned it to you, I'm pretty sure I just gave you that kind of introduction, didn't I? At that point, I didn't have more than that, just a couple of oblique references in stories and diaries.
It's very much the introduction that a friend, a fellow truth forager, would when they tell you that, it piques your interest. It's clocks are of course a fascinating thing. They have fascinated mankind for millennia. The ability to tell the time and seasons, that our lives are chained to time, inescapably so. And there's something uh, deep, spiritual, and otherworldly about time, as well as it being such a real hardline thing. And the clock, of course, is such a vital part of that. Whether hanging on the wall, standing sternly like a grandfather clock, or upon one's watch wrist. Of course, I don't wear a watch myself because it's an easy place for the government to plant a device to listen in and
Absolutely.
track your. Yeah, ridiculous, ridiculous not to wear watches in this day and age. There's many ways to tell the time without carrying a watch. You could
The flight
always,
of birds is the most reliable, of course, but there are others.
and but there are fewer real life birds these days. More have been replaced with the robotic types. So
Of course.
and those can purposefully trick your time telling by being programmed
One
to
might
fly
assume that
wrongly.
is, in fact, their principal purpose.
And I can believe it, often to make people work longer shifts at work,
Mm,
thinking that only 5 hours have gone past when actually it's 9. It's why evenings
mm,
feel so short, of course.
mm,
Um, but yes, back to time, back to clocks. So when Rick, you came to me with this interesting tale of this cursed clock face, I I looked into it. You had no pictures, of course, at the time. Victorian times, pictures are
mm.
limited at best. There was no reports of its resting place, but there were a few sketches from local cartoonists of the time, I suppose, Rick. But they're hard to rely upon. Some just showed as if a face in a box, which of course was not how it was.
Mm.
Two little eyes and a mouth pointing out, but it showed that people had an appetite for it, Rick. It did seem like it became the talk of the town.
Absolutely, and it was one of those things that people whispered to each other as salacious gossip, and but almost nobody seemed to have actually seen it for themselves. It was like it was a story that people have just concocted out of nowhere. As you and I know, those things just don't exist. Everything has some grain of truth in it, some origin point. And I was pretty much destined to assume, I think, that there was no way I would ever get the to the bottom of this story. It was just too remote, too distant in time, and the clock was, after all, of a type that could be moved from place to place, and it could have been destroyed, or even if it still lived, it could have been moved to somewhere where it would never be seen again. Um, some dusty attic, or or possibly in a library, somewhere that nobody would ever go. But the truth is, it is definitively the case that as I decided there was nothing here, there was nothing more I could do, um, my eye did fall across a little paragraph of my research, and I realized there was a just a possible route to go forward. Um, and it wasn't something that had sort of occurred to me the first time I wrote it down, because even for someone like myself, with all of my years of experience, it is possible to overlook something really obvious in the notes. But it transpired that I had written in my notes, in my own handwriting at a certain point, that the clock was indeed a grandfather clock. So it occurred to me that it is possible that the clock was made of someone's grandfather, hence the name. And with that tiny little clue, I went back through everything that I had done, and it wasn't too long before I realized that there was one individual whose name had come up in one form or another, who did, in fact, have an extremely notable grandfather, the noted occultist Aleister Crowley. And a thought occurred to me. I wonder if Crowley's face and hands had been included by his grandson into a grandfather clock. Now, of course, that would mean that the dates were all wrong. All of the references couldn't possibly be Victorian. But of course, you then look at it and you think, okay, if you scrub out the idea that the original myth goes back that far, and assume that there's a possibility that people were telling the story even though the clock didn't exist, but then it inspired someone to make the clock from the story. Well, that means there's still a grain of truth in those original myths, even though there wasn't at the time they were told, which piqued my curiosity. And I went looking into the Crowley records, and to my astonishment, I discovered that there is a possible route by which this could have come about. So I set off on the trail, as you can imagine.
Of course, it was um, it was a fascinating um, journey that you took. Of course, going from Victorian times to well, the 40s, basically. There was quite a difference, and
Mm.
I found myself caught very much in the old Victorian tales that may have influenced Crowley and his grandson, you say, um, and such things there, and where such an occultist would get ideas.
Mm.
And there were many tales around this so-called cursed clock face um, that led to terrible situations. None proven in records, of course. The police weren't the best record keepers at the time. I'm sure we can agree that we all know there were many deaths and situations, mysterious situations, um, magical situations. Some would say that were not reported or covered up. A little bit, the smallest bit of snuffling around, you could find out about. It doesn't take much from the era. Um, but it seemed like the original story was sometimes told almost as a ghost story, a sort of be careful story to stop
Absolutely.
children from fiddling with parents and grandparents' clock faces,
Mm.
winding around, changing the time for a bit of fun.
Quite right. And, I, of course, now had a living person I could interview, someone who might have created this this clock. Um, and so I went to find um, Crowley's granddaughter
Hmm.
and spoke to her at length, initially on her doorstep, and then later through legal representatives and court transcripts and records. And it transpired that I might have got rather the wrong end of the stick with that part of the
Ah.
story. But in one of those transcripts, when I look back over them, there was a thing that struck me as curious. It was pure fluke, perhaps, but Crowley himself had, apparently, a remarkable clock. Um, and I was wondering if there was some kind of connection. And then, of course, as I read an occasional description of this clock and what was strange about it, people pointed out that it was weird and creepy and that it was a grandfather clock. And suddenly it occurred to me that it might not be that Crowley was the grandfather, but possibly the grandson. And with that in mind, I visited a number of places where Crowley's estate and belongings have gone, including finding some unusual photographs. Now these are old and grainy,
Oh,
but
excellent for proof.
as a consequence, I find them compelling and well, you've seen them as well as I have, and I'm obviously we can't show them here because of copyright reasons, and
Mhm.
also they could cause alarm to the audience if they're not properly prepared. But well, you tell me, do those look, in fact, like a clock made from a grandfather?
It's, you passed me first of all, you sent me photocopies. Uh,
Mm.
faxes, as is your want, of course,
Hmm.
of the original photos. And it was, I must admit, the graininess on that. For me, I'm a modernist. I hold my hand up. Um, the that was a little bit too grainy for me. I know that you were pointing out things. You were quite clear. You'd circle things in ink, like with big handwritten notes. You know, this is obvious. Can you not see? And it was difficult. But when you did visit me, You paid me a visit, which was wonderful. We sat in the back of a pub, sold a few pamphlets together, and I got to see the photos firsthand. Um, and yes, there was graininess, but that always adds to the reputability of them. Um, I would say in two or three of the photos that were taken in one of the houses, that clock, I think the hands were indeed, I wouldn't say a full hand, but definitely like a pointing fingers.
Mm.
It's what it looked like to me. I think I would like to get my hands on the clock, but I think, and anyone that sees those photos, I think would be difficult to refute that completely, Rick. Like, two
I,
pointing hands.
I'm pretty confident that when you look at the texture of the clock face and those slightly unusual markings and creases in the surface, when you when you look at the hands, uh, it seems to me that it has to be a very great likelihood. I would fall short of saying it's definitively proven. I would need to have the actual item, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it does look very, very convincing to me.
It's I think when you started pointing it out, it became much clearer to me. And sometimes we need someone to point out parts of a photo to help us to understand those that have spent more time poring over. And I know that there is the condition of seeing faces in different things, in rock faces, in the man in the
Mm.
moon, in Arctic ceilings. You know, people see faces everywhere. It's something the human mind
Absolutely.
goes for.
Yes, it is a known property caused by the fact that there are, in fact, faces everywhere.
And it's I think often the most simple answer is the correct answer.
Mm.
Um, and I think here those people that are looking for at the clock face, expecting a human face there, um, it's subtler than that. It's not a front on of the face. The skin has been
Mm.
used, but it's not like the hands come from the nose and the six is the mouth, for example. It's not like that.
Absolutely.
It's not like that. That would be distasteful, I think, and people would have proven it much sooner, Rick. I think.
I think if that were the case, it would have been so obvious that, I mean, anyone walking past it in the family home might have become so obviously alarmed that they would have possibly called the police, which frankly would have been a great disappointment because it would have robbed us of the opportunity to investigate.
Absolutely. Um, this clock, Rick, could will we have a chance to investigate it in person? I know sometimes terrible incidents fall upon suspicious items, as if there is a cover up.
I have been unable to locate the clock in question precisely enough to go and visit it. But I am told by more than one source that there are people who have seen it, and I have been to the places they have seen it, and it has been moved. I
Mm.
believe it is currently in an archive of Victorian relics, which is used as a resource for um, companies making television dramas. So periodically, you will need to make a piece set in Victorian times or in the 1920s or in medieval times, and you go to companies where they can hire you out. They can literally rent you a collection of clothing and items that are period appropriate. I have not been able to identify which company the the item is with, but I believe one day it will be just selected offhand without thought by a person picking it for a film set and suddenly one day I'll be watching the BBC,
Hmm.
and I will see it in glorious high definition color just right in the middle of the screen for a brief moment, and that will be a remarkable thing. Um, I'm just desperately hoping that it doesn't go on ITV program because my television does not receive ITV.
Oh, only very modern TVs do, Rick, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
Um, there was a rumor, and I'm I'm sure you would know more about this than me. I'm just a mailman, as it were. But I did hear that the director of the Disney cartoon of Beauty and the Beast designed the character of Cogsworth specifically as I, I believe the youngsters call them Easter eggs, something to make people think about the possibility and to research it more. Is this true, or is that just idle tittle tattle from the youth?
I I've heard repeatedly that there is an Easter egg hidden in Beauty and the Beast. Um, it's not as obvious as in some Disney cartoons. I think, as everybody knows, the most famous Disney cartoon Easter egg is surely the one in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, where as a little subtle uh, joke to be played on the audience to pique their attention, they completely destroyed the narrative integrity of the story and changed the ending to make it meaningless. Um, but in this case, it's perhaps a more subtle Easter egg than that. Yes, I have heard this, and though I've heard it from more than one source, I think it was you who raised that to me the first time that that might be a reference. And when I looked at it, I I did the proper incantations and got to see the film myself. I think there is definitely a possibility that that is an Easter egg, and it is, after all, a good place for such an Easter egg because it is in a Gothic tale.
It's very true. And what is more gothic than a grandfather clock made of human body parts, after all?
Well, yes, unless it were, say, a group of individuals cursed to be tableware.
Mm, it's a terrible thing. This terrible things
Mm.
happen to good people. Um, but anyway, the speaking of time, time is slipping away from us, Rick, as it always does. Um, and it's something we could talk about for a long time. This urban myth has many years of history, lots of photographs, clips, news from family members, old rumours from Victorian times, and so on and so forth. And it's something we could spend a long time on, and you already have in life. Um,
And I suspect I will go back and revisit it from time to time whenever a rumor surfaces or something catches my eye.
I think it's that sort of myth. I think it's something that can be easily returned to when you've not got anything else on the front hob, as it were.
Hmm.
You can go to. But for now, in the case of the cursed clock face, a Victorian clock created using the actual face and hands of potentially Alistair Crowley's grandfather, maybe
Hmm.
some connection with the occultist Alistair Crowley. Um, do you believe, or do you remain sceptical in the existence of this clock?
Normally, I would be tempted to say that something so obviously like like a film script story is probably fictional,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's so lurid. But every time I turn back to it, I see more and more that suggests it must be real, and I am confident that at some time, and maybe not that far in the future, we will finally lay eyes on the cursed clock face. Um, I believe.
That's sensational. Rick Bishop, you have spent a lot of time researching this, and I think it warms my heart that a cynical man like you, um, can really get involved in such a tale across hundreds of years almost, and
Mm.
it's a wonderful thing. And I wish that in this case I shared your belief in it. I think maybe because I myself have researched less, and it's my own shortcoming, and I understand that. And I think if I research more, I would believe. But for now, I think the responsible thing for me is to remain skeptical. I'm very happy to join you the next time you delve back in, and I'm sure that you will have me believing very quickly. You're probably the most persuasive person I know, most persuasive person I know, Rick.
Well, remaining skeptical is a wise choice for the trained mind until something happens that flicks you over into being a believer. And certainly, I would argue that it's a responsible choice. It really is.
Well, thank you, and I think it's important to not just dive headfirst into such things. We have responsibilities as the truth foragers to remain level-headed,
Mm.
and earning our belief is something that a myth really has to jump through a lot of hoops to achieve. Thank you, Rick. It was lovely to revisit that. It must be said, it's something I haven't thought about for a while. What a wonderful tale.
It is a charming and delightful story, certainly.
Um, well, would you like to talk about the second one for the evening?
Oh, yes, that would be lovely.
It's it's more bang up to modern day, and it's again it's night focused, as it were, but it's something that is definitely something from the last 10 or 15 years, and that is the case of the night cubicle, in as much as the tale of cubicles in a workplace and
Mm.
the loneliness of a night worker there, of an evening, Rick.
Mm. They are, well, anybody who's ever been to one of those open plan offices knows how extraordinarily soulless they are. Um, it's like a battery farm for the miserable. Um, but this one um, was one that I had no knowledge of until you raised it with me, and this was quite recently, wasn't it? It was only a few months ago we discussed it, and then it was only in passing. It was one of those moments where I asked what you were looking into and what you were working on at the moment, and you just mentioned the night cubicle. Um, and at the time when you started describing it, it sounded bizarre and disturbing to me. But perhaps you've gone on and found something that makes it feel less extraordinary, or maybe it's spiraled into something greater.
It's it's a tale that piqued my interest. As you know, a few years back, when I was struggling for money, my hens weren't laying so well, so I wasn't able to sell the eggs to passers-by from the end of my drive. And for a while, I had to take on work uh, in a call center. I didn't sell many things. Apparently, my tone and the way I talked to customers was not what the management wanted. But having had a taste of it, um, there was a little bit of chatter among among the desk jockeys um, of sort of, you know how parents would tell ghost stories to the kids, how
Of-
how if you're in a setting, there's always someone telling you of something in a similar setting just to keep you on edge, just to bring a little bit of fear, just idle tattletale among the people. And this one, the night cubicle, is was such a tale. It when I first heard it, my first thought was just, oh, this is excellent. Uh, this is a great mysterious story to tell people. This is a wonderful thing. This has got a good amount of edge to it, a little amount of creepiness to it. And it's only when I looked into it more with you, which we'll go into in a second, that we realised there might be some truth to it. It's about a man, and it seems like it's a tale that is told in numerous offices in different settings, so potentially more than one setting. And it's a man who would work evenings and would be the last member of staff in the open office. He would have his desk, and at some point he would go to the toilet, and the energy saving lights would switch off as he left the room and went to the toilet, and as he returned they'd switch back on again. And he found out that one time he took a wrong turning and accidentally went into what would normally be a meeting room, I believe. But instead, as he went through the door, he was back in the main office space. And the first desk he went to was his cubicle, exactly how he left it. And that's a fantastic story, Rick. It has the loneliness, it has the darkness, it has the confusion, and I think that's what I led with for you, in the hope to get you looking into it.
Yes, indeed. That was certainly what attracted me to it in the first instance. There were a number of things that I found compelling about this and made it deeply worth investigating. One was the way that, by its nature, it seemed inherently unprovable
Mm.
and something that could easily just be a trick of the mind caused by somebody working late at night and perhaps very tired, which is exactly the kind of thing that, therefore, more conventional investigators would dismiss. This is where I think we are at our best, when we are looking into things that everybody else would say, surely there's a rational explanation.
Mm.
And we would say, yes, of course, there's a rational explanation, but what if that isn't the explanation? And certainly from my own experience, and I know we've discussed this in the past, it is often the case that the vast majority of the rational explanations turn out to be wrong. The more you look at it, it turns out the rational explanation is not the only one. It is a very interesting thing. I I found a reference to it in a little story written to a local newspaper, and I showed you that one. And apparently, in that story, um, which unfortunately is one of those where somebody told me this, and then he
Mm.
heard it from someone else, which is irritating because it loses the direct eyewitness account. Um, Apparently, having gone to his cubicle, he returned to work for a little while, working alone in this possible alternate cubicle. But when he got up to leave for the night, a thought occurred to him. What happens if he goes back into that meeting room? And he did. And apparently, in that meeting room, he found himself back in the cubicle farm once more, and returns to his cubicle for the second loop through the cycle. Um, this story appealed to me on a number of levels, most notably the fact that there is no obvious route to unravel
Mm.
yourself back to the beginning, is there? If you're going through a multiverse or something in this way, there isn't an obvious route back. The only doorway you found is the doorway to the meeting room, and that only goes one way, so to speak. Um, but you actually corrected me on that point. You looked between the lines, so to speak, and found that there was a way back out, didn't you?
There is there is a way out for the night worker. Sadly, it's not one that people can be too proactive about. Um, so, as you say, once the night worker gets into this loop of, it sounds very much that the first time they get up and go to the kitchen to make a coffee, or go to the toilet, or go to do photocopying, they can just return to their desk. But if they go through to another room, they do end up, like you say, back in the cubicle farm again, and the first cubicle is theirs. And you do get into this loop, as you say, a confusing loop for those tired ones. If they're tired, they might not think anything of it and just continue getting their coffee, going to the loo, just going through the drudgery of the spreadsheets and so on and so forth. Um, but it appears that the only way out is that when their when their shift time is up, that is when, as if the loop is broken. So once they've completed their shift pattern, their hours, and they go to leave, when they go through the lift door, whereas if they do it beforehand, if they get off the lift, they're back in their cubicle, of course, back in the cubicle farm. But after that time, when they press the lift button, they will appear on the ground floor and are able to leave. Time-based loops, Rick, are not unheard of, and that brought possibilities to me, I think.
I think we've both looked into a number of these kind of stories over the years. There are examples of time displacement and examples of geographical displacement. I mean, regular uh, listeners to our podcast, readers of our pamphlets, and viewers of this very stream might recall the Hopper's Hut.
Of course.
But it is, they are sufficiently common that you might think that it's just a quirk of human nature that we think this way when we think about it. Where I think it becomes easier to appreciate the absurdity of it, though, is as the story gets just a little darker. Um, because as you'd looked into it, and I was only checking an occasional source, and then I saw a reference to the following night, so to speak. Our our poor victim, whoever he was originally, was of course required to go back to work the following night, and the story, as it was recounted at least, turns a little darker, doesn't it?
It's it's a fascinating thing, and again, this is why it's a wonderful, if nothing else, ghost story to tell, as it were. It's you could tell it at work over a few days, and build on it and build on it, and you're right. As it goes, as I was first told, on the second day, the night worker returns to his cubicle, and this time, wondering whether he had fallen asleep, dreamt it all. Um, for the first part, we'll try not to leave the cubicle at all. Fear and confusion. But when he does, often he will then leave some sort of totem at his desk, for fear that, just to ensure that it's his cubicle, to help him center his mind, I guess, in some. Okay. Stories are told in different ways, as they often are. Some talk of him leaving a very specific mug with a coffee ring on the inside. Some a satsuma. Others even his car keys, before he needs the toilet or so and so. And when he returns to whatever room he goes into, the first cubicle he finds will have his totem there, Rick. Which, as step two of the chilling tale, sent a shiver up my spine, and I'm sure it did yours.
It obviously does. make for an interesting correlation in itself, because on the one hand it makes it seem creepier and weirder, and on the other hand, of course, it could just as easily be evidence that the whole thing was imagined,
Mm.
because it means you've proven nothing unless you're prepared to believe the dimensional shift. No, it was the next part when you told
Mm.
me that, with each loop through, a second identical item appeared on the desk, um, which initially, as you say, was a Satsuma, I think, or pencil, something fairly replicable. But on his second trip through, to come back and find two sets of car keys was, I think, quite disturbing for the man.
It's um, it's certainly not what you would expect on your return. Um, I think that would put confusion and potentially fear into me in that situation. Of course, as the story goes, the original story, the man would run for the lift, holding both sets of car keys, and of course, the lift would reopen again, straight back by his cubicle,
Mm.
another set of keys, and now he has three sets of car keys. And what do you do at that point? This is, I think, often the tale goes one of two ways: panic or denial, hiding in the
Mm.
toilets, or trying to sleep. It's all a dream kind of thing, which is human conditions, Rick. Hide in the toilet or try to sleep.
Um, and as we know, each of those brings its own perils.
Mm,
Um, Toilets are famously a very, very dangerous place to hide. And as for going to sleep when in the middle of a threat, um, that is, well, it's a brave move indeed.
mm,
So the route out via the lift would seem to be the safest option, but again, we're dealing with somebody who is supposed to be there, who is working at night, late at night, alone in this cubicle farm. It's a frightening position to be in.
mm,
It is it is quite commonplace that the threat that we pose is driven directly by capitalism. And on this occasion, our poor victim was required to be at his desk. And imagine his terror as he sat there, flinching at every breath of wind and every echo or sound from outside the building or within. I mean, it must have been a terrifying experience, for which he was barely getting time and a half.
mm. And that's it. If one was getting in the olden days and getting two or three times the pay as one would do back then, maybe you could put up with it more, somewhat, accept it in return. But in modern times, it becomes unbearable
Mm.
in a way. The day three for me, the final, well, the final evening of the tale
Mm.
is the one that chills me most to the bone, Rick. And this is where the uh, the lights and the shadow come into play.
This this did obviously raise the stakes, rather. The idea that, there is possibly a multiverse. It is capable of recreating entities and loops through time and overlapping them on each other, was always going to be a, a challenge. But a relatively well lit office room might seem like a strange place to have a sort of a terrifying shadow or a terrifyingly dark experience. But our brave hero had had an idea of something that he needed to do in order to satisfy himself. And yes, this part of the story certainly, I think, adds a certain degree of credence to his report because it opens up fascinating new opportunities and avenues and understandings. What he did was to walk to the main entrance by the lift and turn out the lights. And in that darkness, he perceived all sorts of strange fears of what might be stalking him or what might have happened. I believe he'd been through at least one iteration of the loop on the third night before turning the lights out.
Mm, very much so, and I think what they say, of course, led him to do it was when he'd returned with his coffee. As I said before, when to save electricity, they come to save money, I suppose. The lights flicker out when there's no one there. They'd flicker on in the kitchen, and then as he entered back into the cubicle farm, the lights would flicker back on again. Um,
Hmm.
but in his first return, um, the lights in the far corner did not flicker on and left a shadowy corner, a surprisingly inky darkness.
And you have to say it was courageous of him, however timid he was in his movements, that he walked over to that little nook by the
Mm,
windows. And who hasn't been slightly alarmed by at night those vast shiny black panes where you can only see your own reflection in them because the outside looks completely dark.
mm.
But he allegedly crept over there and eventually arrived in that darkened corner, looking around to see if what was special there. And I don't know what it was, whether it was a sound or whether it was just an idle thought of his, but eventually he turned and looked out of the window. Initially, of course, seeing nothing, he reached up and cupped his hands around his eyes to see if he could see anything outside. And, well, what he saw was an identical looking office building with a well lit floor of cubicles with just one dark corner cast in shadow, and in it, a person looking very much like him with his eyes pressed up against the glass, peering back,
Mm.
them covered by hands. That must have been a truly shocking experience for the poor man.
And to be honest, it explains why he rushed to turn the lights off himself. It's something that there is not a chance that someone in their own sanity at the time would have done in such a terrifying that day three of such a terrifying loop. But a desperate man, I suppose, flicking those lights off, looking for if uh, if he could see better into this sudden other building.
Mm.
Um, of course, when he flicked them on again, the 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 darkened corner was darker and larger. They didn't all come on, and he, when he returned to the windows, he could no longer see the building next to him.
Mm. Um, and I mean, you and I might interpret that to mean that the loop was unraveling again, back to reality, back to normality. But for him, perhaps a less experienced person in dealing with matters that are bizarre and strange, it must have just seemed that the erratic coming and going was even more alarming.
The the tale always ends after the third loop, and there I've heard four different endings, which I've shared with you, and I guess it'd be nice to finish to go through those four endings. We can take it in turn. We do two each. We know the endings,
Mm.
because I think each of them tells a different tale of the psyche of humanity, of capitalism, of of, of human nature, I suppose.
Mm.
The one I'll take is the one where the cleaner um, early next morning finds the man dead, sat at his cubicle, um, suffocated with a satsuma in his mouth.
Mm.
It's the most route one finish. It's for me. It feels like it's the cop out. It's the 11-year-olds telling a ghost story ending,
Yes.
and it's the one that if this is indeed a true tale, it's the one I hope is not true. I think
Mm.
it's a man who's reached the end of his the end of his wits, and perhaps ends it there, or he does another loop and a satsuma comes back in his throat. But it's a weak ending for me, and it's one that I hope is not real. Unlike the next one of yours, which is better, I think.
I mean, the the way it was told, the so-called email ending. Um, Allegedly, he, in a panic, returns to his desk and tries to send an email asking for help. And every email he sends is undeliverable.
Mm.
Um, they all bounce one way or another. And he decides to send a copy of an email to his own account so that he'll have one um, for reference the following day, assuming the loop continues. Um, he sends the email, and it doesn't appear in his inbox, despite not reporting an error message. Um, and he's sitting there waiting for a moment to see if it's just a slowdown on the server. You know, these things can
Mm.
happen. Um, and then suddenly the email pops in, only it doesn't say, his original title. It has re in front of it.
Mm.
And when he opens it, apparently another him has responded and is alarmed that him is seeing him in this building. It is, I mean, I like it in the sense that it sort of closes the loop of the story, but it doesn't give me a satisfactory ending as to what happened next.
Mm. It's true. It's whimsical in a way. I quite
Mm.
like it. There's something to it, but I see your point. Um, for the third ending, I'm going to take. I know you'd have taken this one if through choice, but I'm going to take it. It's the ending where he, upon the other building vanishing, when he returns the light back on, he sees the time, and he braves himself to go and make another cup of coffee. And when he returns, there's another figure sitting at his desk, which is him,
Hmm.
but a faceless copy. He turns around and
Yeah.
it's all him, but it's no face, just the skin. And of course, shocked, he runs away, barges through the lift to get downstairs. But of course, that reopens to the cubicle farm,
Mhm.
where there's now two of his cubicle with two faceless figures of him. And he finds himself caught in a loop where, before long, he is surrounded by a room of faceless clones of himself,
Hmm.
trapped there forever. Who knows? But for me, it feels like that feels like a tale of the corporate clone. That it feels like a ghost story ending for the worker, I suppose. And I like it. There's something about it I
Yes.
like.
Hmm.
It doesn't feel believable, but that's a nice a good tale to tell for the fears of capitalism and corporations and such like.
Absolutely true. Yes, that does feel like a rounded conclusion. Although,
Hmm.
again, I'm not convinced it necessarily ticks all of the boxes for a satisfactory ending. And I mean, who knows where that ending would lead either?
No, exactly. Well, there is one more ending, Rick, of course.
And one might argue it's perhaps the most open ended, certainly the most disturbing of the set. And, well, certainly I feel the one that um, would explain how a government might decide to step in at some point and shut down the speculation. The way the story goes, allegedly, he is walking around the floor, panicked and unsure what to do when he hears the lift
Mm.
binging as it changes from floor to floor, with the lift car getting ever closer to his floor. He, alarmed, decides to hide around the corner from the lift door rather than remain in sight. Um, the doors open, and a person who may in fact be a copy of himself walks out. He only sees him from behind, of course, because of where he's hiding. But a person walks out, and he decides that this is his opportunity to escape and throws himself through the lift doors just as they're closing. Um, but in that version of the story, we don't initially learn what happens from his perspective,
Hmm.
but instead he finds himself walking away from the lift back towards his
Mm.
desk as if he'd just left the lift doors just moments earlier. He sits down, and then once again the lift starts to bing, and he hides, and this repeats over and over and over again. In this version of the story, the following day, he is found on the cubicle farm floor, literally curled up in the corner, crying and screaming and incoherent. He's taken away by the authorities, and the for a while everything seems to return to normal, and until following some complaints about a discomforting level of malodorous working environment, the building is briefly shut, and at the bottom of the lift shaft, a pile of, in one version, 8, in another version, more than 30 identical bodies are found twisted and broken as they fell to their deaths. Um, in such an instance, you can easily understand why a government department would be dispatched to keep things quiet.
Mm. Absolutely. It's I think what I like about the Night Cubicle is, and I'm going to nail my colours to the mast. I I remain sceptical of the Night Cubicle,
Mm.
always have done. But for me, its strength is that it is a tale that can be told over and over again. It can't be disproved, and it brings with it a warning. It brings with it um, a, a certain fear, a worry, and I think there's power in that. Whether there is truth or not, I think there's power in the tale, Rick. Um,
Mm.
how do you feel about the Night Cubicle and its various endings?
Well, I have to say, um, I find one thing in particular very disturbing about it. The nature of the story is one that we have told each other back and forth a number of different times with a number of different endings, and we've repeated it again tonight in a number of different ways with a number of different endings.
Mm.
And at the back of my mind, there is a little part of me wondering if you and I are, in fact, repeating the story over and over again for some connected reason.
Mm.
Maybe we are ourselves trapped in some form of night cubicle loop. And our version of it is that we retell the story over and over, and possibly more endings will emerge over time as we try different ways out of it, if you know what I mean.
Mm.
That does alarm me just a little bit. Um, However, until I can see the story from the outside rather than looping round it myself, I must also, I'm afraid, remain a little bit skeptical.
And I think it's understandable. By its very nature, it feels like a ghost story. But as you say, I think more research, more delving in, and you could lose yourself in a way. So perhaps it's too frightening to delve into more. Maybe it's left well alone.
Absolutely. Perhaps that's exactly where we should leave that one. Maybe walking away is the right choice. Maybe that's an option that the putative victim of the night cubicle at one point had and then failed somehow to act upon.
Well, as always, thank you, Rick. Thank you for uh, going through that with me. A, a, a chilling tale, I would say. Um, we have one more this evening, if that's okay with you, Rick.
Of course.
It's um, it's from originally the 1970s. It's um, it's a tale of something that was very popular back then. Um, you must remember it, Rick. Snooker, televised snooker was incredibly popular in the 70s
Mhm.
and the 80s,
Yes.
and it gained a lot of popularity, being shown on television,
Mm.
whether watched in black and white, which is always interesting, or color. The haze of cigarette smoke, the 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 brown liquids of the alcohols, and so on. The characters at the time, but for those sat watching it alone late at night, Rick, there are some very interesting stories about watching the late night snooker, and it's something that I know that you watched a lot of old tapes in
I
research.
did. And um, I mean, before we go any further, I think it's important that we do give a brief safety warning about this one.
Mm,
Um, because of we are here delving into the world of mind control, of course, and for those who choose to watch snooker, um, and I don't mean live, by the way, this is televised snooker only. Um, there is it is critical to understand that you must be wearing the appropriate protective eyewear while doing so. Your carefully tin-lined hat will not protect you
mm,
from this particularly insidious form of mental control. Um, for those who are not aware, um, snooker as a game was invented as a way of passing the time by the military, and the military often have ulterior motives. And in this specific instance, the idea was to assess whether certain patterns of colors and shapes would evoke a mind control response in people um, who witnessed it. It was, I think it's fair to say, a fairly catastrophic failure in practice because the numbers of people who could be impacted were so few. Standing in the corner of a gentleman's club with a cue in your hand, it's not necessarily the most easy way to get mind control across. The person you're aiming for isn't looking at the table the whole time. They are distracted by other things, and they're probably in the process of also eating a sandwich.
mm.
But once television arrived, it was essential to get it onto the screen as quickly as possible, which is of course why we moved to color television in the first place. over the course of the next few weeks and months, they rapidly realized, just through the relatively large sample size they had, that they'd got some of the colors wrong for their mind control experiment, and they changed, I believe, three of the colors to different hues of green, pink, and blue, as I recall. Um, and then the extent of the conspiracy got worse, which we discussed actually not that long ago.
Mm. It was yes. So as you say, mind control, um, and they're looking at patterns, colours, movements. Um, what they found through televised snooker was they could add in the two things. Firstly, the lilting tones of the commentators, who were very much, we found out, and this is something we'd never realised before, I guess. Um, we came across some of their scripts, their carefully written scripts that they'd been given. There were very specific words they were given to commentate with in very specific ways. Terms, the flow of the sentences, um, the fact that the snooker matches were actually set up. I won't say fixed, but they were arranged in a specific pattern. That this was not a free sport. This was a carefully orchestrated program.
Mm. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you and I have for a long time speculated about the ability to program human minds using things like barcodes. Um, I noted that the zebras at London Zoo, in particular, had had their stripes repainted in order to evoke certain feelings in people walking past and seeing them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the world is becoming more sophisticated for these mind control experiments, and snooker is a peculiarly good example of how to do it with quite a complex code. All you have to do is control the movement of the pattern from shape to shape, and that is relatively straightforward to do on television in a sport that is ultimately deterministic. If you strike the ball in exactly the same way every time, the exact same outcome will occur. The whole purpose of the game is to reduce to zero all possible variation in movement and pace. It is astonishing that they've got away with it as long as they have, because without being silly about it, if you were asking people to believe that um, the reason that snooker was so widely broadcast and viewed by the viewing public was because of the gripping edge of your seat drama, the physical exhilaration or excitement, or the brilliant, masterful tactics of the game, people would look at you quite oddly. They would say, "No, no, you just hit it with a stick."
Hmm.
Um, and yet, as you say, it became overwhelmingly popular. I think its decline in popularity presumably is because the government agencies involved or extra government agencies involved have moved on to other forms of mind control.
I,
And it worries me that I'm not as sure what those might be.
that is the thing. There's always new. There is rumours, of course, that Big Brother, Love Island, such programs are what they've dabbled with. Uh, made in Chelsea, I hear very specifically, is one to they've been using to attack the brain and dumb down individuals. But
I think with that one, they're not even hiding it. I mean, the several of the government's more secretive intelligence agencies are based in Chelsea, after all.
it is very true. They've gone very route one with that.
Mm.